everyone, and welcome back to Refugee Matters, a series where we unpack topics that impact folks of the refugee experience and those who have experienced forced displacement in the U.S. My name is Nancy Flores, and I'm the Deputy Director at NPNA, and so grateful to be here facilitating this conversation today and joined by two wonderful guests who you'll hear from shortly. Today, we're going to be discussing a really important and timely topic. We're going to be talking about immigration narratives. How is the world talking about the current state of immigration and refugees and asylum seekers, and how this affects our communities? And we'll also be sharing messaging guidance for communication experts from communication experts in the field. Since the end of Title 42, we've seen media coverage that negatively depicts people seeking asylum. And this has been problematic on so many levels, right? There's a lot of misinformation that we know is being shared and echoed. And in today's segment, what we want to do is really tackle these xenophobic messages that are often based in lies and fear-mongering, and really learn about the ways in which we can challenge these anti-refugee, anti-immigration narratives. And how we do that is by uplifting stories that accurately reflect the depth and beauty of our communities. So I'm very excited to get into this topic, and joining me today are two of our wonderful speakers. So I want to tell you a little bit about their backgrounds and the expertise that they bring into this space. So first, I'd like to welcome Kate Brick. She is the director of the Refugee Advocacy Lab, a partnered effort housed at Refugees International and co-led with the IRC, International Refugee Assistance Project, and Refugee Congress to grow the movement for U.S. leadership on refugee protection and inclusion. Kate has spent the last 15 years working in policy advocacy, campaigns, and coalition building to advance the rights and inclusion of immigrants and refugees in the U.S. and internationally. Prior to joining the lab, she held leadership positions at the Mayor's Migration Council and New American Economy, where she led a team working in more than 80 communities across 30 states to advance welcoming policies. Welcome. Great to have you, Kate.
Thank you for having me. I'm so thrilled to be here.
All right. And next, I want to introduce Tasha Moro, who is the Communications Director at Justice Action Center. She joined JAC with a decade of nonprofit communications experience in service of social movements. Most recently, she spent 8 years as the Communications Director for the National Lawyers Guild, where she grew its digital audience tenfold, launched digital programming initiatives, and created a publication outlet featuring legal analysis, artwork, and poetry by people in prison. Prior to that, Tasha worked with Latino Justice, PRLDEF, NALEO, and the Hispanic Federation in various civic engagement, voting rights, and communications capacities. So wonderful to have you. Welcome, Tasha. All right. So we're going to go ahead and get started. We have a lot of ground to cover, and thank you again for all of our experts, and thank you to all of you that are tuning in. For a lot of us, this has been a really difficult moment to just read all of the headlines and read about some of our issues, and specifically the narratives that are casting immigrants and asylum seekers, migrants in a negative light. So we really want to dig into some of the research behind this. So first, we're going to start with you, Kate. The first question here is, what are some of the takeaways from the research that the lab has conducted about refugees? And can you share with us what, from that research, what is relevant to the conversation and this time that we're living in with the asylum seekers?
Yes, thank you so much, Nancy. It's really wonderful to be here with all of you. So just to give a little bit of context on this research and how it came together, the lab was created towards the end of the last administration, in part because we saw the consequences of what happens when we lose control of the narrative. And so during the lead up to the 2016 election and throughout the Trump administration, we all remember, and unfortunately still to some extent now, but then especially there was an incredibly toxic, misinformed public narrative on who refugees are and why they come here, which ultimately led to the complete deterioration of what had historically been an American legacy of bipartisan support for welcoming people seeking safety. And so when the lab was created to help build a movement to support support refugee resettlement, we knew that key to that was being able to communicate more effectively and more compellingly in a way that not only was going to counter misinformation, but ideally bring in new partners and champions from audiences who are more difficult to reach. And so we spent 2 years doing extensive research in partnership with Goodwin Simon Strategic Research. We did polling, focus groups, style testing, social media analysis. We wanted to really understand how Americans were thinking about refugees, what resonates with them, what doesn't. And then from that, we developed a set of tools and messages to not only effectively communicate, but ideally to help our community expand support for people seeking refuge. And so there are several findings, and I think, for today, I'm going to focus more at a high level, but happy to talk through them in more detail in the Q&A. And I would preface this by saying, to your point, Nancy, that this research was done specifically around how the American public thinks and feels on refugees. But I think a lot of the lessons really hold true across the community for people seeking asylum, for the undocumented population, and for other new Americans as well. So first and foremost, and this is not going to be a surprise to many of you tuned in today, those of you who work in communications or narrative work in the immigration space, we know that there is no silver bullet on this issue. Americans hold complex, often conflicting perspectives, and they're informed by their values, their emotion, their lived experience, their identity, their beliefs, and often, unfortunately, misinformation that we see in the media. And so in order to make progress on such a complex emotional issue really requires a multifaceted approach that can't be captured in a single or even a few simple talking points or hashtag. So the best way that we have found to do this is by meeting the audience's emotional and informational needs up front. And so there are 3 kind of strategies that I want to focus on today. And the first is using values-based messaging. So even when audiences can't understand or identify with the specific circumstances that refugees or people seeking asylum have faced, they can connect with the idea of wanting to keep their family safe. And we tested shared values that really, really resonated with the American population that we surveyed, and that was rising to the top of several were freedom, community, family, and resilience. So really using these shared values in our messaging can be effective. The second strategy is providing information, insight, and context that can help to correct flawed assumptions that people have about who refugees are, who people seeking asylum are, and also to fill knowledge gaps, because we found that there are so many misunderstandings. People don't know the difference between a refugee, an asylum seeker, and an immigrant, what the process is for them to get here. And so grounding people in what the reality is, it can help level set. And part of that, I think, and specifically as it relates to refugee resettlement, is explaining how people got here, the extremely intense and complicated process that exists that involves years and years of vetting and people having to wait to come to the United States through this very structured process. And then also really focusing on what their lives are like here in the United States. And that sort of leads to the second piece, which is that it's really important to talk about the full arc of someone's life, not just their moment of need. And so that also helps to sort of counter misperceptions that people have that, people are in a constant state of need, that they're a drain on resources, that they're not contributing. We all know that that is definitely not the case. And so it's helpful to contextualize and localize the conversation with who people are, what they do in their community, where do they work, where do they go to school or send their kids to school, where do they worship, making this feel more tangible as opposed to something that seems really unrelated to them and their and folks' daily lives is very helpful. And then related to that also is acknowledging that people have concerns, even if they're unfounded or misinformed, and then really providing a clear solution for what we want to see. So an example of that at the lab, a lot of the work that we do is at the state level. And so to this concern that people have, there's a sense that, people coming here aren't contributing. We talk about, the many, many ways they are contributing as taxpayers, as business owners, as employees, but also what some of the barriers are that are preventing people from really thriving in their communities by not having access to the workforce for various reasons, not having access to higher education, not being able to communicate because there aren't services in multiple languages, for example. And then we'll provide very concrete solutions for what needs to be done to address that. Then the third point that I would highlight today is that the messenger really, really matters. So we found that when people with lived experience share their stories, they are by far the most impactful messengers. And I think that really speaks to how Nancy opened this. And within this, it's really important to elevate a wide range of messengers to show that there are so many different experiences of what it means to be a refugee or what it means to be someone seeking asylum. And just anecdotally from the research that we conducted, we saw a dramatic shift depending on who the messengers were. We saw an 8 percentage point drop among respondents who thought the US should decrease the number of people that we welcome as refugees, and a 19% increase among people who thought that the US should increase the number of people that we allow to come here seeking refuge, when the person speaking was someone who had lived experience. So, I think this together with using messages that are grounded in shared values is specific. While the research was specific to refugees, I think cuts across and can be used as a strategy for the work that we're all doing, regardless of what population that we're talking about. Personalizing and humanizing the experience is really critical. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. And I love I want to pull at this thread a little further, just the humanizing, right, of folks that, like, I consider myself, a first generation person whose parents are immigrants. And, I think that I was having a conversation with my family about, the photos that we're seeing and what's happening at the border with the asylum seekers. And it's like, we're not like two different groups, these newcomers and the folks that have been here. My mom, I think, said it really wonderfully. Well, she said that was me, that was me in a lot of ways a few years ago. So I think about how important it is for us in the immigrant advocacy space and refugee advocacy space to really not give in to that othering, right? Like, we can't other within our own community, right? If all we have is each other, right? Sometimes it really feels that way. So I want to pull on that a little bit more. I know that the lab has done some polling recently, one on refugee resettlement and the other one that was just released this week on access to asylum. So as we're talking, now living in a post-Title 42 world, what are some of the biggest takeaways from these polls that you can share with us?
Well, yeah, the timing of this conversation was so perfect for the poll that we just released, but it was built upon a poll that we did towards the end of last year, and then we re-upped it again a few weeks ago, and the findings were really encouraging and validating, especially when it comes to our approach of centering people who have lived experience as key messengers and as impactful messengers. So in the fall, we conducted a poll of more than 1,000 likely voters, and we wanted to gauge at that time support for refugee resettlement. So the question was specific to, do you support the United States having a program to resettle people who are seeking safety? And what we found then was that the vast majority of Americans, 71%, support resettlement across the political spectrum, across age, educational background, religion, race, and that included 60% of Republicans. And this finding was really consistent, actually, with polling over the years around American public attitudes towards resettlement. But what was new and really significant was that number of 71% support jumped to 89% if the person reported to know somebody personally who's a refugee. So this really, really speaks to the power of people with lived experience as messengers, and why storytelling and building those personal connections is such an important strategy for this movement. So that was conducted at the very end of last year, and we just did another round of polling a few weeks ago. It was conducted actually the week after Title 42 was lifted. And in this poll, we were able to add a question. So we added a question around access to asylum. We asked whether people believed that those seeking safety should have the ability to request asylum at the southern border. And we specifically said the southern border, not just sort of request asylum. We wanted to understand how people were thinking about the border in this moment of sort of the peak of the Fox News border crisis chaos narrative. And in this moment, we found that the majority of Americans, 55%, do support the ability to seek asylum at the US border, at the southern border. And when we break it down by party, we see that that is 77% of Democrats, 55% of independents, and 34% of Republicans. We also saw that there were large swaths of support among young voters. So people under the age of 45, there was 62% for asylum, access to asylum, and 65% of Black likely voters also support access to asylum. So in terms of what does this mean, I think that despite this pervasive narrative that we see that the border is being overrun, that the majority of Americans still believe that we should have access to the right of asylum, and the vast majority of Democrats, which I think is really important for us to send that message to the Biden administration as we continue to see kind of more and more retreat from what is currently or was originally the law that allows anyone to access asylum or to seek asylum at the border. As we see that protection eroding, I think it's important that the Biden administration knows that his base still fully supports that right.
All right. Thank you so much for that insight and for the great work you all are doing at the lab. I want to turn the next question over to Tasha. I think, recently it's been just overwhelming to read all of the different headlines. And then it's like a lot of these governors are really, like, it seems like competing for the spotlight on who can send buses faster here or there. And it's just, what I call kind of a dog and pony show. And we're going to see more of this as we head into election season. And, these are people's lives, like this is something that's really dire. And it's so shameful to see that politicians are really making this an opportunity for political stunts. So, Tasha, can you tell us a little bit about, as we're talking about immigration narratives based off of Justice Action Center's research, what did you all find that are things to avoid when engaging in immigration narratives, and what should we embrace instead?
Yeah, thank you so much, Nancy, for having me and for everyone who joined. So my name is Tasha Moro. I'm the comms director at Justice Action Center. And what we do is we use both litigation and storytelling to advance immigrant justice. So we wholeheartedly believe that the law and narrative power are both really great and necessary tools to tangibly improving the lives of immigrants. So I'm really excited for this conversation. Justice Action Center worked with BSP Research to put together a message testing project over the course of about a year. That consisted of 3 phases. The first was done in partnership with the Immigrant Defenders Law Center, where we surveyed about 130 asylum seekers themselves to get a feel for what they would like to see in narratives about asylum seekers. And then we did a focus group of mostly Latina voters who are kind of in the middle politically, knowing that Latina voters are starting to kind of shift a little more to the right, even on immigration. So we did a focus group with them. And then finally, we did a national survey of about 1,200 voters across the US. So that's just kind of like a general outline of what our project looked like. And what we found, luckily, was very much in line with what Kate described. So what we found is that using very clear, simple language with narratives that are grounded in foundational values like fairness and equality and freedom resonate most broadly. As we know, and as Kate mentioned, the immigration system is extremely complex. Nancy, too, you talked about how it's really hard to keep up with every single way the landscape changes from day to day. And Obviously, most voters, members of the general public, do not know all the intricacies around the immigration system. So, removing kind of like specific references to certain policies or legislation, and talking about things in really broad terms. So instead of, just talking about asylum, talking about seeking safety or seeking freedom, is another way to kind of have folks separate these human experiences we're talking about, um, from this really political, contentious issue that's been, in the headlines, so often. So, um, that's one thing that's really important. And when we talk about values applied on a systemic level rather than these individual policies, we also help to calm the assumption of immigration being inherently problematic or confusing or chaotic and dysfunctional. We kind of want to uh, calm the audience's um, expectation that, from what they've heard in the news a lot, that there is just absolutely no solution to immigration challenges, and that there's no way forward. This is what we want to combat with this values based, clear messaging rooted in values. In particular, the value of freedom performed really well, and it's, I think, a really great way to kind of reclaim the freedom narrative from ways it's been used in recent years to kind of actually exacerbate xenophobia and white nationalist sentiment in the U.S. So talking about the freedom to move, to do what's best for your family, to live the life that you want to live, is able to resonate with audiences that aren't necessarily pro-immigrant to begin with. Um, yeah, another thing to embrace is to talk about folks' full story. So, one thing we heard from asylum seekers is that they want not just what they're fleeing to be at the heart of their story, but also the life that they're looking to build once they do reach safety. Um, a lot of asylum seekers told us that, they don't necessarily want all the trauma and horrific experiences that cause them to flee to be kind of the center of their story and what's being told about them. It They'd also like to see kind of an acknowledgement of their full lives, not just the most traumatic moments in it. Um, and then finally, what I'll say is it's really important to be solutions oriented. So talking about folks in a very humanized way, as Kate described, is really important. Acknowledging that people aren't a monolith, and that, these metaphors of talking about migrants as in terms of kind of these water metaphors of surges or waves or floods, it's really harmful and dehumanizes the experience of each person, fleeing for their life. So talking about folks as their full selves and being solutions oriented, um, to include in your messaging that, there are organizations dedicated to welcoming asylum seekers. They're at the border and the interior, doing this work day in and day out, and yet they're not, necessarily fully supported by the administration or their municipalities. And these are really the folks that we should be looking to for solutions around asylum and how to build trust with communities who are in these really precarious situations. So those are just a few things we found through our project, and hopefully that that helps everyone shape some powerful narratives.
Thank you, Tasha. You know, when we opened up the conversation here, we're talking a little bit about um, fear and the role of fear as just a really powerful tool in moving narrative, right? We saw that under the previous administration, um, and that fear is really a powerful thing, you know, when it comes to getting a reaction out of people and really having shaping, you know, what they're thinking and how they're responding to certain things, especially on an issue that they don't know very much about. So I have one more question for you, Tasha, and then I want to get to some questions that are coming in the chat. But going along with fear, we also see a lot about a lot of these narratives really come from from a point of scarcity. So, many of these anti-immigrant narratives are centered around scarcity and argue that we don't have the resources to welcome asylum seekers. Tasha, how should folks be responding when we're getting these questions either from local reporters, from folks in our community, or just hearing these arguments generally?
Yeah. So as you said, Nancy, this fear and crisis narrative that's rooted in scarcity is really, really effective. We see it all the time in the media, and it's really hard, honestly, to combat that in times of, inflation, for example, or a pandemic. Um, but with the focus on these foundational values, that helps kind of allow for a more growth mindset to evolve. And eventually, we want to get to a place of abundance to have, folks shift from that scarcity mindset to an abundance mindset. But um, what, we can tell folks is that you just have to look around in your own community to find examples of welcoming. Um, as I said, direct service organizations are doing this, 7 days a week, and have systems and infrastructures in place that welcome lots of folks efficiently and effectively. And aside from, NGOs, we have everyday Americans through humanitarian parole programs, for example, uh, offering to sponsor their global neighbors um, to live in the U.S. So, for example, there was the Uniting for Ukraine humanitarian parole program that was launched under the Biden administration and resulted in tens of thousands of Ukrainians being um, welcomed into the US. And now there's the humanitarian parole program for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans, which has garnered 1.5 million applications from American sponsors who are raising their hands to say, I'd like to sponsor someone, whether it's a family member, a friend, or even a stranger, to come to the U.S. for 2 years, and I'm able to, support them to do that. That is, you know, uh, these are private sponsorship programs that have gotten a tremendous level of support from everyday Americans, and so we have those examples to look to know that folks are ready to engage in this work and eager to do so. Nancy, the example of having, mayors busing migrants in these political stunts to other cities. Whenever that happens, there's you know spontaneous group of volunteers that comes together, figures out what these folks need, and helps them in their next step on their journey. So I think it's something that's not as prevalent in the media, of course, because the success that they have with these crisis and fear-based narratives. But if you take a look, for example, Welcome with Dignity features um, Welcome Wednesdays, where they highlight examples of these types of everyday efforts for welcoming every Wednesday. And so I think it's a little bit harder to find in terms of, you know, mainstream media, but the desire and the willingness to welcome folks is already here. And if we use our values-based narratives to explain the why as to you know, the reasons why people are doing this, even in, you know, coming out of a global pandemic or coming out of uh, inflation. I think it's a really inspiring and moving example to folks to kind of understand that it's not it's not a zero sum game.
Thank you. Thank you for those questions, for answering those questions. And I think that what this time does is that while it shows the worst in people and politicians in this time, now so it's a very American thing, right? At the same time, it also shows the best of our country, right? It also shows like there has always been that resistance to, you know, these really horrible policies, and I think that we can't let that not be visible, right? So I appreciate that very much. We are going to go with a question that is in the chat here. So Paul is asking, and this is for the lab, did you compare the results with how Congress voted when it comes to funding refugee resettlement? So I'll have you take that question here.
I mean, I think that there's a broad theme that we see across this issue, which is that public opinion polling is not reflected in how Congress votes typically. And partially that's because Congress isn't really representative all the time of what the American people think and feel or how they would vote because of gerrymandering and a million other reasons, or that there's a very vocal minority that pressures others in the party, and all the political dynamics that are at play there. So I don't know how helpful it would. I think if we have not done that like direct analysis, but if we did, I'm pretty sure that we would find for this and many other polls on this issue that broadly the American public is much more supportive, whether it's a refugee resettlement or the ability to seek asylum, or whether we need to have a solution for people who are undocumented. There's broad American support for that, even though we haven't been able to pass something in Congress for decades now. So I think it's really highlighting to members of Congress in their districts that this is what their constituents want and believe in, and continuing to echo that message.
Great. And in the interest of time, we're getting more questions, but we can't get to all of them. So I'm going to close this out with a very broad question for the both of you, and perhaps we'll touch on what folks are asking here in the chat. So the question for both of you is, what is one thing you want people to take away from this conversation? We'll start with you, Tasha.
Yeah, so I think generally, one thing to take away is that everyone has a story to tell. No population is a monolith, and I believe that the more stories we tell, the more connection and understanding we build. So never underestimate the power of storytelling, especially in immigrant justice work. Um, and also never underestimate the power of working in coalition or in partnership with others. I think that our the immigrant rights movement is really strong. It's really diverse, and I think we have all the tools to rise to the challenges that are in front of us. So storytelling is one fantastic tool to get there, and yeah, that's just basically my plug for more storytelling and humanizing of asylum seekers and immigrants, especially when there's a lack of compassion and willingness to engage with their stories. So that's what I would say.
Thank you, Tasha. So same question for you, Kate. What is one thing you want people to take away from this conversation?
So Tasha synthesized it perfectly. And so instead of saying the same thing, I will give a resource to people so that we can all elevate and find platforms for more folks to tell their stories. So I want to share that the Refugee Storytellers Collective is a partnership between the Lab, We Are All America, Refugees International, Refugee Congress, several partners, several national partners. And what it is it's a space that's led by people who've experienced forced displacement and believe in the power of sharing their story. And we together, to Tasha's point about the importance of partnership and coalitions, it's really a perfect example of that, because we all work together to find platforms and opportunities for people to share their stories, whether it's on panels or through op-eds or testifying in front of their elected officials. It's a free opportunity for anyone from all over the country who wants to participate. And we offer monthly trainings to folks that are part of that group to refine their storytelling skills. So I would plug the Storytellers Collective. And the last thing I would say too is that at the lab, the purpose of the lab was to be a supporting and building capacity for the field, and the work that we do is meant to be a public good. So we offer trainings that go into much more detail on the findings of that messaging research that we did. And so if folks in the audience are interested in learning more or want to organize a training for their folks or their community, their organization, just reach out and we will schedule something.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for joining, for our speakers, for We Are All America, for creating the space for us to have these really important conversations. And, this is a movement moment, folks. This is a moment in time, a moment in history. And what we know is that the other side, the anti-immigrant side, is going to be very loud. It is very loud. So we also need to be loud. And our speakers have given us some wonderful tools and some wonderful frameworks to really go and run with. And I think that for me, what I've been really intentional about in this time is listening, right? Listening to those stories and really being able to, through the messengers, how do we elevate platforms, for them to really share their truth and share their stories. So thank you all so much for joining. This has been Refugee Matters, and we are so grateful for this space, and we'll catch you next time. Bye, everyone.